The deed lay unrolled across her knees, and the water had already found the sole of her boot before she reached the last line of it. Sedge Fen, 40 acres, to the use of the said Judith, Duchess of Renmore, together with all rights of Turbrian pasture appertaining. She did not yet know that the ink drying on that page would unmake a man's fortune before the leaves turned. She only knew that her feet were wet, and that her husband's cousin was smiling at her, the way a man smiles at a joke he has waited a long time to tell. Absalom Creed stood at the edge of the causeway, with his hands folded behind him, immaculate to the last button, in a place where nothing else was immaculate, and he watched her read the deed the way another man might watch a child open a box he already knew was empty. "It is generous of his grace," he said, "to think of you at all in the settlement, when there was so little land left that was not entailed to the name." His voice was gentle. It was always gentle. Judith had learned in 6 weeks of marriage that gentleness, in this house, was a thing men wore the way they wore black, as a kind of mourning for whatever they had already decided to bury. She folded the deed along its old crease, and did not let her hand shake in the folding. 40 acres of standing water, she said. It is generous indeed. Creed's smile did not move, though something behind it shifted, the way ice shifts before it cracks, without sound, without warning. "You will find, Your Grace, that the fen keeps its own accounts," he said, "and it does not forgive a debtor." He said it kindly. That was the worst of it. Beyond him the water lay black and unhurried under a sky the colour of an old coin, sedge and cotton grass bending in a wind that smelled of peat and rot and something colder underneath, and out past the reeds she could see the low roof of the old sluice house, half drowned, its gate chained shut. A gate did not need chaining, she thought, unless someone still meant to use it. She filed the thought away, the way her father had taught her to file every observation that did not yet have a use, in a drawer at the back of the mind, unlabelled, waiting. Her father had drained 3,000 acres of worse ground than this in his life, and had died owing money on all of it, and she had inherited nothing from him but his instruments, his ruin, and his stubbornness, which she wore now the way another woman might wear pearls. 9 years running, Creed went on, this fen has yielded nothing but ag and the drowning of good stock, and 9 years running the water rights on the old sluice have reverted to Stroud's mill down river, for want of any drainage to dispute them. He said it the way a man reads out a debt already settled in his own favour. If the fen stands idle again past Michaelmas quarter day, the covenant runs another 9 years unbroken, and Stroud takes the water outright, and no one at Renmore need trouble themselves over 40 acres of mud again. 12 weeks, she said. It was not a question. No, madam, he agreed, 12 weeks. She looked out at the water a long moment, at the reeds moving all one way and then the other, at a heron standing perfectly still on one leg, as though it, too, were waiting to see what she would do. And something in her chest, that had been folded very small and very flat for a long time, began, very quietly, to unfold. She did not say what she was thinking. She had learned that too, in a smaller house than this one. In a colder winter than this one promised to be, that a woman who showed her hand before the game was called had already lost it. She only said that she was obliged to him for the tour, and that she would not keep him from his dinner, and she watched him go back up the causeway, with his coat unspotted and his boots unmuddied. A man who had walked to the edge of a swamp and come away perfectly clean, which she thought was itself a kind of confession, if only she had someone yet to say it to. Alone, she crouched at the water's edge and let her fingers trail through it, cold and full of silt, and found that the silt was wrong, too fine, too even, laid down in sheets rather than scattered by any natural flood she had ever seen her father describe. Water does not lie, her father used to say, folding his charts by lamplight, while she watched from a stool too small for a girl of 10 who should have been asleep. It only goes where it is let. She said the words over now, to no one, to the heron, to the darkening water, and stood, and wrung out her hem, and did not yet know that she would say them again, twice more, to 2 men who would each hear them very differently, before the fen gave up what it was hiding. Gideon Thorne, Duke of Renmore, was standing at the library window when she came in still wet to the knee, and he did not ask her why. That alone told her something about him worth knowing. A lesser man would have asked, and made her account for herself, and she had married one lesser man's worth of accounting already in her life, and had no wish to marry more of it now. He turned from the window instead, and looked at her the way he looked at most things, with a stillness that gave nothing back, and said only that Sedge Fen was poor land to be given as a wedding portion, and that he was sorry for it. "It is the land I was given," she said. "I do not require an apology for arithmetic, Your Grace." "It was not arithmetic," he said. "It was what remained." His voice did not rise, though something under it had gone taut, like a rope pulling straight. She had learned in 6 weeks that this was the whole of his temper, not heat, but tension, a held breath where another man would have shouted. She set her wet glove on the sill between them, a small deliberate object, the way she might have set down a card in a game whose rules she was still learning. "Then give me leave to do as I like with what remains," she said, "full authority over the fen, the water, the letting, the labour, with your name behind it, and no hand upon it but mine." He studied her a moment. Outside, the last light was going long and gold across the lawn, and somewhere in the elms a bird she did not yet know was calling, low and hollow, like breath blown across the mouth of a jar. "You want to drain it," he said. It was not a question either, and she found she liked that in him, that he did not waste breath asking what he had already seen. "I want to farm it," she said. "Draining is only the first debt to be paid." He almost smiled. She watched it happen and not happen, the way a man's face moves toward laughter and then remembers itself. It was a strange thing to want, he said, from a woman 6 weeks married. She had gone over the answer to that in her mind more than once since the wedding. A wedding conducted in a lawyer's parlour with 2 witnesses and no flowers, arranged between his need of an heir and her need of a roof, feelings disclaimed by both parties as plainly as the settlement was signed. "I did not ask to be loved, sir," she said now quietly. "I asked only to be useful." Something crossed his face at that. Not hurt, she thought, or not only hurt, but a kind of recognition, as though she had named a thing he too had been carrying, and had not expected anyone to name for him. "Then be useful," he said at last, "and be careful, for I have buried enough this year without burying a wife in a bog besides." It was the first time he had called her that plainly, without the weight of the title around it, and she found she did not mind the wetness of her hem half so much after that. Later, in the kitchen passage, she met the old fenman who kept what was left of the sluice, a bent, brown, unhurried man named Amos Rudd, who chewed an unlit pipe as though it owed him money and spat, with great economy, into the herb bed before he spoke to her at all. "So you're the one means to drain the devil's own washtub," he said. "There's men in this parish been drowned trying less." She told him she did not intend to be drowned. He looked at her a long moment, up and down, the way a man appraises a horse he has already half decided to buy. "Your father were Collegate," he said. Not a question either. Everyone in this story, it seemed, preferred to state their suspicions rather than ask them. I read his book on the Fenwick drainage when I were a boy. Man knew water like his own blood. She said that her father had known a great many things and had died owing money on most of them, and Amos spat again, thoughtfully this time, and said that dying owing money was no proof against a man, only proof that the world was badly arranged, and that he would meet her at the sluice at first light if she meant business and not merely temper. She told him she meant business. He looked for the first time almost pleased. The soft threat came 4 days later, delivered over tea Judith had not asked for and did not want, in a morning room where the light lay thin and pale across a carpet worn soft by other people's feet before her. Absalom Creed sat with his cup balanced on his knee, and his cravat arranged with the precision of a man dressing for a portrait, and he spoke to her the way he might have spoken to a favourite niece about a suitor he privately thought beneath her. I have seen Fens taken in hand before. Cousin, he said. He had taken to calling her cousin within the fortnight, a small intimacy she had not granted, and could not quite refuse. And I have seen the men who took them ruined by it. Honest men, careful men, better men than you, will find willing to labour for a duchess's fancy at harvest wages. He set his cup down without a sound. It is not my place to forbid you anything. His Grace has been plain on that account, and I would not presume to cross him. I only wish you to know, before you spend his coin and your own good name on 40 acres that have beaten better engineers than your father, that I have watched this house a long while, and I have watched it survive by knowing which battles were not worth the winning. He smiled at her over the rim of his cup, and it was, as ever, a perfectly gentle smile, and she thought again of ice cracking without sound. I intend to win this one regardless, she said. Of course you do, he said. Everyone does, at the start. Below the window she could hear the servants' gossip drifting up from the yard the way smoke drifts from a chimney no one has swept. The mad new duchess and her ditches, someone said, and someone else laid a wager, half in jest, on whether she would have the fen dry by Christmas or herself in it. And a third voice, older, hushed the others with the flat authority of long service. Though not before Judith had heard enough to know that the whole house had already chosen its verdict on her, before she had cut so much as a single trench. She minded it less than she might have. She had spent a girlhood being underestimated by people with better coats than sense, and had learned that being underestimated was, on the whole, an excellent place from which to work undisturbed. That afternoon, walking the causeway alone with her father's old level and a notebook bound in oilcloth, she found the second thread, and did not yet pull it. The sluice gate, chained as it had been chained on the day of the deed, showed fresh grease at the hinge, dark and recent, not the pale crust of 9 years' neglect. A chained gate that no one used did not need oiling. She crouched at the gate a long while, turning this fact over the way her father had taught her to turn a stone before deciding whether it was worth lifting, and wrote in her book, in a hand grown small with discipline, hinge greased within the month, chain new, gate itself sound where the walls above it are not. Someone tends what they claim is dead. She did not write Creed's name beside it. She did not yet have cause to, and her father had taught her that too, that a suspicion written down too early became a conviction too easily, and a conviction arrived at before the evidence was a debt a person paid for the rest of their working life. She closed the book instead, and watched the light go long and copper over the reeds, and heard, far off across the water, the low hollow call of the bird she still did not have a name for, calling and calling into a stillness that gave nothing back. The way, she was beginning to think. Half the men in this house gave nothing back, and meant everything by the withholding. She learned the bird's name from him, in the end, on a morning 3 weeks into the work when he came out to the fen unannounced, in boots that were not new, and found her ankle deep in the first cut trench, with her sleeves pinned back and mud to the elbow, directing 4 of Emmos's men with a competence that made 2 of them forget, briefly, to look surprised by it. "That is a bittern," he said, when the sound came again, low and strange, like wind blown across a bottle's mouth. My brother used to say it sounded like the fen talking in its sleep. He said the word brother, and then went very still, the particular stillness of a man taking a blow without letting his face report it, and she did not press him, only noted it, the way she noted the hinge grease, for a use she did not yet have. He crouched at the trench edge instead, and asked her, plainly, how deep it need go before the water would consent to leave, and she found herself explaining freeboard and fool, and the arithmetic of a proper cut, with an eagerness she had not let herself feel, since her father's study had been sold out from under her, page by page, book by book, to pay debts that were never, in the end, entirely his to have made. He listened the way Creed never listened, with his whole stillness bent toward her words rather than around them, and when she showed him the level, the brass and mahogany instrument that had been the one thing of her father's the creditors, had not thought worth taking. He turned it over in his hands with a care that surprised her. Working hands, she thought, for a man of his rank, calloused faintly at the base of each finger, in a way that spoke of reins and tools, and not merely of signing papers at a desk. "Teach me to read it," he said, not an order. A request, plainly made, and she thought that was perhaps the first wholly undefended thing he had said to her since the wedding. She taught him. It took the better part of an hour, and somewhere in the middle of it, correcting his stance at the sight-line with a hand at his elbow that she withdrew a beat too late to seem entirely businesslike. She told him, carefully, in pieces, the way a person hands over a coin they cannot yet afford to spend all at once, that her father had died believing his last great drainage a triumph, and had been dead 6 weeks before the parish discovered the embankment had failed, and half his life's work was under water again, and that she had spent the better part of 2 years since answering for debts she had not incurred to men who spoke of her father the way Creed spoke of the fen, as a thing already known to fail. She did not tell him about the hinge grease. She did not tell him about the sheets of silt laid too fine and too even to be accident. Those she kept, the way her father had taught her, in the unlabelled drawer, waiting for their use. He was quiet a long moment after she finished, turning the level over once more in his hands, and then he said, without any particular emphasis, that her father sounded like a man who had been ruined by other men's arithmetic rather than his own, and something in her chest that had stayed folded very flat and very small since the funeral came loose at the seam, just slightly, just enough to ache. Later, walking back along the causeway in a silence that had stopped being uncomfortable somewhere in the last quarter hour, he laughed, not loudly, not for long, only a short surprised huff of breath at something Amos said about the 4 workmen's opinion of duchesses who could out-level a surveyor, and she found she had turned to look at him before she had decided to, the way one turns toward an unexpected warmth, and thought, with the particular clarity of a fact newly filed, that is the first time. She did not yet know how many more times she would count, before the fen was dry. The water in the mill Leet at Stroud's had dropped by a hand's breadth within the fortnight, and the letter that came of it arrived on a morning bright enough that its bad news seemed, for a moment, like a mistake of the weather. Obadiah Stroud did not write it himself, his solicitor did, in the flat, correct language such men reserve for other men's ruin. Informing His Grace the Duke of Renmore that any diversion of water customarily, and of ancient right supplying Stroud's mill, would be met with an application to the Quarter Sessions, for injunction and damages the letter estimated at a sum that made even Gideon's stillness crack for a visible half-second at the reading of it. Judith read it a second time over his shoulder, standing close enough to smell wet wool and beeswax, and felt something cold settle where the warmth of the level lesson had been sitting only days before. "It is not diversion," she said. "It is drainage. The water was never his by right. It was only his because no one had troubled to stop it running to him." Creed, summoned to explain the covenant, explained it with the mild patience of a man laying out a hand he has held for years, and is only now, regretfully, obliged to play. "The old sluice covenant grants Stroud the water in any season the fen stands unworked," he said, "and I did caution her Grace that draining active land could be read as a breach of 9 years' quiet enjoyment." He looked at Judith with something almost like sympathy, which she trusted less than his contempt had ever cost her. "Perhaps, cousin, if you had consulted the muniment room before you consulted your trenches." It was, she thought, watching him, a very fine piece of work, the way a forged coin is fine work, correct in every particular but the one that mattered. She said nothing of the hinge grease. Then, 3 days later, Creed came to Gideon alone, and told him she had this only second hand, from Gideon's own mouth that evening, delivered with the careful neutrality of a man repeating a thing he did not want to believe, and could not quite dismiss, that old Thomas Colligate had once treated with Stroud's father over this very water, years before, and that the treating had ended. As the elder Creed had heard it told, badly for everyone concerned but the Colligates, who had walked away with a fee and left the parish to sort out the flood. "It is likely nothing," Gideon said. "It is likely an old man's malice dressed as memory." But he did not look at her the way he had looked at her over the level, and she felt the difference the way one feels a door closing 2 rooms away. No sound, only a change in the pressure of the air. "You think my father sold that water once and is selling it again through me," she said. It was not a question, though she wanted, badly, for him to make it one, to deny it outright rather than to stand there with his stillness turned, for the first time, against her rather than beside her. "I think," he said slowly, "that I do not know your father, and that I did not know, until this week, how little I knew of the water either. I only know that the sum in that letter would beggar a smaller house than this one, and that a wife who came to me with a full account of an old covenant before she opened a single trench would have saved us both a great deal of grief." It was not unkind, the way he said it. It was worse than unkind. It was reasonable, and she had spent a lifetime learning that reasonable men, doubting reasonably, could do more damage in an afternoon than a villain could do in a year. "Then, let me finish," she said, and she heard her own voice come out steadier than she felt, the way her father's voice used to come out steady over a chart while his hands, out of sight beneath the table, were not steady at all. "Give me until Michaelmas, as the deed already allows, and let the water answer Stroud's solicitors instead of me." He did not answer at once. Outside, cloud was building low and copper-bellied over the fen, the particular colour the sky took, she was learning, just before a fen storm broke, and somewhere in the reeds the bittern cooled once. and was still, as though even the fen were holding its breath to hear what he would say. He gave her 3 more weeks before Stroud's men grew impatient enough to force the matter, and in those 3 weeks the trust between them, which had been building the way water builds behind a new cut bank, thin and quiet and easy to mistake for calm, began instead to show its first hairline cracks. Cordelia Thistlewood called twice in that fortnight, a beauty of the old polished kind who had, by every account in the servants' hall, expected to be standing where Judith now stood before a poor gentlewoman's practical marriage had inconveniently intervened, and she took her tea in the morning-room with the particular graciousness of a woman auditing another woman's failures for later use. "I do think it terribly brave of you, Your Grace," she said, touching one earring with a fingertip, "to make such a public spectacle of the land no one else would take. Some might call it desperation dressed as industry." "Some might," Judith agreed, and did not otherwise oblige her, and watched Cordelia's smile tighten by a fraction that told her more than an hour of plainer speech would have. It was Stroud himself, in the end, who forced the reckoning, arriving unannounced at Renmore's gate with 2 men and a writ demanding the drainage cease pending judgment, and it was Creed, gliding into the hall at exactly the moment his cousin's authority was most needed, and least in evidence, who made the offer that Judith would come to understand, long afterward, had been the whole design from the first oiled hinge. "Sell the fen outright," he said to Stroud, at a price Judith privately thought generous to the point of confession, and the suit falls away, the covenant dissolves by mutual consent, and her Grace need never set foot in a bog that has already cost this house more in 3 months than it has earned in 3 generations. He said it kindly, as he said everything, and he said it in front of Gideon, so that refusal would look, to any watching eye, like temper rather than principle. "Take the money, cousin," he said, "and take the peace that comes with it. No one would think the worse of you for choosing your husband's comfort over your father's ghost." She looked at the paper Stroud's clerk held out to her, at the sum written there in a careful copperplate hand, enough to clear every debt her father had left unpaid, enough to buy her for the rest of her life the one thing she had never once been permitted: safety without labour. She thought of the sheets of silt laid too fine and too even to be any flood God had made. She thought of a chained gate, freshly oiled. "No," she said. She did not raise her voice. She had learned, in this house if nowhere else, that the ones who never needed to raise their voices were the ones who frightened Absalom Creed most, and she watched, for one unguarded instant, something flicker behind his gentle eyes that was not patience at all. It was not principle that made her refuse. Though she let them think so, principle was easier to argue with than certainty, and she was not yet ready to hand her certainty to a room that had not earned it. It cost her, refusing. It cost her the easy road, and it cost her, that night, the first real quarrel of her marriage, Gideon pacing the library with a controlled fury she had not yet seen in him, asking her, with a patience gone brittle at the edges, whether her father's pride was worth his family's ruin, and she answering that it was not pride, it had never been pride, it was arithmetic, the water does not lie, it only goes where it is let, and neither of them, in the heat of it, quite hearing the other, until he said, low and final, that he would not watch her burn down his house to prove a dead man honest, and left her standing alone in a room gone dark at the edges, with the lamp guttering low. And she did not weep. She would not give Absalom Creed the satisfaction of it, even second-hand, even through a housemaid's report. She only sat very still, the way the fen sat still under a coming storm, and waited. because waiting, her father had always said, was the only weapon a person without power was ever handed free of charge, and she meant to spend hers wisely. The workmen were gone from the fen by the following noon, pulled off at Gideon's own order. An order she would learn later had been carried to Amos not in Gideon's hand, but in Creed's. Delivered with such smooth and instant obedience that no one thought to ask whether the words on the page matched the words the Duke had actually spoken, and by the time anyone did ask, the damage was 3 days old and settled into the shape of fact. She stood at the trench's edge alone, the cut half finished, water already creeping back along the raw earth the way water always crept back, patient, unhurried, entitled, and felt something in her that had held steady through 6 weeks of a stranger's house, and 9 years of her father's debts finally, quietly, begin to give. It was not anger. Anger would have been easier. It was the older, colder thing beneath anger, the understanding that she had been outmanoeuvred by a man who never raised his voice, in a house belonging to a husband who had not, in the end, chosen to stand beside her when the choosing cost him something. She considered, that long grey afternoon, walking the dead trench alone with her book of unlabelled suspicions clutched against her chest, whether the kindest thing left to do was simply to go, back to whatever poor relation would still have her, back to a smaller room and a colder winter and no Bog at all to answer for. And she was still considering it, with the particular clarity grief lends to bad decisions, when Amos Rudd came pelting down the causeway in the falling dark, with his pipe forgotten in his hand and his breath tearing ragged in his chest, an old man running the way old men only run when the thing chasing them is worse than their own bones. "There's summat under the sluice house floor, your grace," he got out, "and you'd best come quiet. And you'd best come." The rest of it broke off unfinished, swallowed by his own gasping breath, and by the sudden unmistakable sound of a horse coming fast along the causeway behind him, and Judith did not wait to hear the end of the sentence. She was already moving, skirts gathered in one fist, her father's level swinging heavy and reassuring against her hip, toward the low black shape of the sluice house crouched at the water's edge, like something that had been waiting, patiently, for someone at last to come and ask it the question it had been holding for 9 long years. The floorboard Amos had found came up with a groan of old iron and older wood, and beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and dark with damp, lay a box banded in lead, small enough to carry under one arm, heavy enough that Judith felt the weight of it in her wrists before she felt it in her hands. She knew the maker's mark burned into the lid before she had wiped the grime from it. Her father had cut that mark himself, a compass and a level crossed, into every case that held his working papers, and she knelt on the wet floor of a sluice house that smelled of tar and river and 9 years of silence, and worked the corroded clasp with fingers that had gone, for the first time in this whole long ordeal, unsteady, inside, dry as the day they were folded, lay a survey in her father's own hand, dated 11 years back, showing the true course of the sluice channel before Stroud's father had paid. The figure was written plainly, in her father's small exact numerals, a figure that made Amos, reading over her shoulder, let out a low whistle through his teeth, before Stroud's father had paid to have the channel's true bearing struck from the parish. Record, and a false one entered in its place, granting Stroud's mill water it had never in law possessed. Beneath the survey lay a letter, addressed to no one and everyone, in which her father set down, in the plain, unhurried hand of a man writing for a daughter he suspected he would not live to see grown, that he had refused Stroud's second payment to bury the true survey entirely, had been dismissed from the parish's employ within the month for his refusal, and had spent the rest of his working life quietly, doggedly, uselessly trying to interest men of greater standing than himself in a wrong that none of them had any appetite to right. He had died, she understood now, kneeling in the wet dark with the letter shaking gently in her hands, not a failed engineer at all, but an honest one, ruined by the very silence she had spent 2 years assuming was his own poor arithmetic. Amos crouched beside her, uncharacteristically silent, and it was in that silence, listening to the horse draw nearer along the causeway outside, that they heard the second voice, young, frightened, unmistakably Nathaniel Wick, Creed's own clerk, calling out to whoever rode with him that he wanted no further part in it, that he had kept the false sluice logs at Mr. Creed's order for 3 years, believing they covered nothing worse than a bad debt quietly managed, and that he would not, could not, put his name to a man's ruin, merely to save his own place. Judith rose from the floor with the box against her chest and her father's letter still warm from her own hands, and found, standing framed in the sluice-house doorway, with a lantern raised and his composure, for the first time since she had known him, visibly, dangerously thin, Absalom Creed himself, come to see for certain what 9 years of careful accounting had finally, inconveniently, brought to light. Sir Josiah Pell convened the hearing 3 days later in the long room at Renmore, that had not held a full quarter sessions gathering in a generation. Tenants and freeholders packed shoulder to shoulder along the walls, Stroud and his solicitor seated stiff and correct on one side, Creed on the other with his cravat, for once, arranged a fraction less than perfectly, and Gideon standing at the room's edge with an expression Judith could not read, and did not in that hour have leisure to try. She had asked for the standing herself, before the assembly, rather than let another voice carry her evidence for her, and Sir Josiah, an old dry man with a magistrate's patience for ceremony, and none at all for nonsense, granted it with a single nod. She laid her father's survey on the long table first, its lines still crisp after 11 years in oilcloth and lead, and beside it Stroud's own parish record, the false bearing entered in a hand 2 shades bluer of ink than the pages around it, plain to any eye once set beside its honest twin. Water does not lie, she said, into a room gone very still. It only goes where it is let. For 9 years it has been let to run to Stroud's mill by a false line struck into a true record, and paid for quietly every quarter since, not in coin owed to this house, but in coin owed from it. She turned then to Nathaniel Wick, brought forward pale and sweating between 2 tenant witnesses, and asked him only one question. The question she had turned over half the night deciding how plainly to put. Who told you what figures to enter in the sluice log, Mr. Wick, and who collected the difference when the true flow and the false one did not match? The room did not breathe. Wick looked once, briefly, at Creed, and Creed did not look back at him, which Judith thought, watching, was itself its own small confession, a man too proud even now to spend his last dignity on comforting the boy he had ruined alongside himself. "Mr. Creed, sir," Wick said at last, his voice cracking on the second word. "Every quarter, for 3 years. He said it were an old debt of the estates, quietly managed. I didn't know. He stopped, and did not finish, and did not need to." Sir Josiah had Creed's own letters read aloud next. 3 of them, retrieved from Stroud's solicitor's own files under order, and never in Creed's darkest reckoning meant to see a public room. Letters in which he named sums, and dates, and once damningly referred to Collegate's old survey as a paper best left drowned, with the man who drew it. The clerk who read them aloud did so in a flat, unornamented voice, and Judith watched something in Creed come slowly, silently apart, as each sentence fell into the listening room. Not a collapse. Nothing so merciful as a collapse, but a long unbuilding, the way a wall gives way not all at once but course by course, when Sir Josiah at last asked him directly whether he denied the hand or the sums. Creed did not answer for a long moment, and when he did, his voice had lost, for the first time in Judith's hearing, every trace of its gentleness. "My father died owing this family £200 he never lived to repay," he said, "and I was made to serve the son of the man who forgave that debt, and never once let me forget the forgiving of it, while lesser men than I inherited what I had spent a life earning the right to manage. I did not steal from Renmore. I only took back, a little at a time, what pride would not let me ask for outright. It was," Judith thought, watching him, "the truest thing he had said in the whole long reckoning, and also the saddest." And she felt, against every instinct trained into her by 2 years of debt and dismissal, something close to pity move through her, unbidden and unwelcome. Sir Josiah did not send him to the assizes. Gideon, when asked what mercy the house would extend, said only that Renmore had buried enough this year, and did not intend to bury a man alive in a courtroom besides, and settled on Creed a small annuity sufficient to keep him from want, on the sole condition that he take ship within the month and trouble the parish no further, a sentence reasoned aloud plainly. As protection for the tenants he had quietly bled for 9 years, rather than as any kindness owed to him. Stroud, shown his own father's forged bearing laid beside the true one, withdrew his suit within the hour and offered, low and chastened, to make restitution on terms Sir Josiah would set, and Cordelia Thistlewood, who had come to watch a duchess humbled, and stayed to watch her vindicated, crossed the room afterward to say, stiffly but not unkindly, that she had misjudged the manner of woman Judith was, and would not do so twice. Judith accepted the apology the way her father had taught her to accept a late payment, gladly, and without comment on its lateness. Gideon found her afterward on the causeway, in the blue hour when the storm that had threatened all week finally broke somewhere out over the water, thunder rolling low and distant like a door closing very far away. And he did not begin with an apology, though she could see one sitting behind his eyes, waiting its turn. "I doubted you," he said instead plainly, the way he did everything. "I will not pretend otherwise, or dress it prettier than it was. I doubted you because it was easier than doubting a house I have run since I was 24 and had no leisure to examine." She said that she understood, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it. She had spent a lifetime being doubted by men, with less cause than he had had, and had learned to weigh the doubt against the doubting. "You did not ask to be loved," he said then, and she went very still, hearing her own words handed back to her across the gap of weeks, transformed by the handling. "Nor did I ask to love a woman who would drain a bog to prove a dead man honest, and nearly bankrupt me doing it." And yet he did not finish the sentence, and did not need to. The bittern called once, far off across the water. The fen's own strange voice folded into the thunder, and she thought that she had never in her life heard a truer courtship than the sound of a man saying, and yet unmeaning, by it, everything he could not yet find smaller words for. They were married a second time within the fortnight, though only the parish register would ever record that there had been a first, a quiet blessing in the old chapel, with no guests beyond Amos, who wept without shame through the whole of it, and told anyone who would listen afterward that he had known she was Collegate's daughter the moment she corrected his level reading, and Wick. Kept on at the estate at Judith's own asking, and Cordelia, dry-eyed but present, which Judith had learned to count, from her as its own form of tenderness. Stroud made good his restitution, and became, in time, an honest if chastened neighbour. Creed sailed in September, and was never spoken of again above a murmur, though Judith found, folding away his last unanswered letter some years on, that she could no longer summon the anger she had once thought his memory deserved, only the pity that had first found her in that long listening room. And she let it stand, unargued, the way her father had taught her to let a settled debt stand. The fen was dry by the following Lady Day, and sown by midsummer, and stood gold and heavy with barley the next autumn, when Sir Josiah's steward came to tally the estate's rents, and found them doubled over any year in the parish's memory, doubled not by fortune, but by 40 acres that had drowned, on purpose for 9 years, finally let to be what they had always been able to become. A year almost to the day after she had first stood ankle-deep with a deed unrolling wet across her knees, Judith stood again, at that same causeway edge, dry-shod this time. Her husband beside her, with his hand resting easy at the small of her back. A child not yet named quickening beneath the fine wool of her gown, and watched the barley move all one way and then the other under a wind that smelled, for once, only of harvest. Far off across the gold water she heard the bittern call, low and hollow, the fen still talking in its sleep, and she thought, watching the light lie long and easy across ground that had once been nothing but water and doubt, that her father had been right about more than drainage. Water does not lie, it only goes where it is let, and so, in the end, does love, and truth, and every stubborn thing worth keeping, if only someone patient enough is willing to open the gate and let it finally run home. If this story warmed you, if you found something of yourself in a woman handed the worst acre in the parish and told to be grateful for it, then pull your chair a little nearer the fire, because there is kettle enough for one more cup, and a place kept warm beside it. I would love to know, in the comments, which line stayed with you longest, her father's, about water and where it is let to go, or the Duke's, about doubting easier than examining a whole house at once. If you would like more evenings like this one, by the hearth, with the lamp burning low, and another story waiting in the dark just past the door, stay a while and keep your place among us. Sleep well tonight, and be gentle, as she was, with the quiet ones who are busy proving something no one has yet troubled to notice.